In 1934, a headmaster was murdered exactly the way a novel on his own bookshelf said he would be. His name was Dr. Elliott Speer, and on a September evening, he was shot dead through the window of his study. It happened in the quiet of a New England prep school, by someone standing in the darkness outside. The nation was gripped by it. For 11 straight days, the killing ran on the front page of the New York Times. And then something almost unbelievable happened. It got bumped. In that same period, the case of the kidnapped Lindbergh baby was still consuming the country, and it slowly pushed the Speer murder off the front page and onto the inside pages. Months later, on a quiet January day in 1935, one last small headline appeared, buried deep inside the paper. Speer's slayer, it said, declared unknown. And that was that. No arrest, no trial, no name. To this day, more than 90 years later, nobody has ever officially answered the question of who killed Elliott Speer. But this is not really a story about a shooting. It is a story about an author. Because whoever killed him did not simply pull a trigger and run. They left behind a forged letter, written in the headmaster's own hand. They staged a death that mirrored, almost line for line, a murder mystery sitting on the victim's own shelf. And then they wrote themselves clean out of the ending. Because no one was ever charged at all. This was not a crime of passion. It reads like a crime that was composed. So the real question of this case is not just who killed Elliott Speer. It is who was clever enough and cold enough to turn a man's murder into a piece of fiction. And why the people who almost certainly knew the answer chose to let the last page stay blank. If a genuine, unsolved historical mystery is what you're here for, the subscribe button keeps them coming. Now let me take you to that campus, and that window. The place was Mount Hermon, a school for boys in Gill, Massachusetts, on the banks of the Connecticut River. It had been founded decades earlier by one of the most famous evangelists in American history, and it carried his stamp completely. Strict, traditional, deeply religious. This was a school built to shape godly young men, run on discipline and scripture and the weight of the past. A place of granite chapels and terraced lawns and old brick dormitories. Fog rose off the river in the mornings, and the New England hillsides turned red in the autumn. Into that world, 2 years earlier, had come Dr. Elliott Speer. He came from a distinguished and deeply religious family, a background that fit a school like Mount Hermon perfectly. He was a minister as well as an educator, a doctor of divinity, a man of faith and learning both. On paper, he was the ideal choice to lead a Christian school founded by an evangelist. He was 35 years old, and he was not what that old school was used to. He was a reformer, and in only 2 years, he had begun to change a school that had barely changed in half a century. He softened the harshest of the old rules. He loosened rigid traditions that had governed the place since its founding. He tried to make the school warmer, fairer, more human, more in step with modern ideas about how young men should actually be taught. To a boy living under the old regime, Elliott Speer must have felt like fresh air moving through a closed room. But every reform has a cost. Every rule you soften is a rule someone else believed in. Every tradition you retire is a tradition that gave someone their authority. Change always creates a quiet ledger of people who have lost something, and who blame the person who took it from them. And most people loved him for it. The students adored him. Even boys he had disciplined spoke of him with something close to affection. One of them said it plainly. They would rather be punished by Dr. Speer than by any other man in the world, because he was fair, and he never once did a mean or unfair thing. That is worth holding on to, because a man that widely loved is a hard man to explain as a murder victim. When almost everyone admires you, who is left to stand in the dark outside your window with a shotgun. Somebody was, and that gap, between how beloved he was and how deliberately he died, is the first strange thing about this case. The evening was the 14th of September, 1934. Speer was at home, in Ford Cottage. It was a handsome brick house, set among the trees. It had served as the residence of the school's headmasters for over 20 years. Below it, the chapel and the campus buildings spread down the hill toward the river. It was a little past 8 o'clock. The evening was settling in over the valley. Lights were on in the buildings across the campus. It was, by every measure, a peaceful autumn night at a quiet religious school. The last kind of place on earth where you would expect a man to be lying in wait with a shotgun. He was in his study, a comfortable, book-lined room, the kind of room a scholarly man retreats into at the end of a long day. And at some point, he stood up. Outside that study, in the darkness beyond the screened window, Someone was waiting. Someone who had chosen their spot. Someone patient enough to stand in the night and watch. Someone who waited for the exact moment the headmaster was on his feet, framed clearly in the light of the window. Then a single shotgun blast came through the glass. One shot. That was all it took. No warning, no struggle, no second chance. In the space of a heartbeat, on a peaceful autumn evening, the headmaster of Mount Hermon was gone. I will keep the details where they belong, which is unspoken. What matters is this. It was over in an instant, and it was precise, almost surgical. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Nothing was stolen. The killer did not come inside. They did not panic. They took one clean shot from the darkness and vanished back into the New England night. That precision is your second clue. Because a frightened, impulsive killer does not do this. This was patient. This was planned. This was, in a terrible way, well written. And when the household ran to the study, the scene that met them belonged to a nightmare, not to a peaceful religious school on a hill. His wife Holly would not leave him. Later, she sat on the stairs in the wide central hallway of that house, holding her dead husband's hand. When the dean gently urged her to go upstairs and rest, she refused. She said quietly that she did not feel as though she should ever leave that spot. That is the human heart of this case, and I do not want it to get lost in what comes next. Because what comes next is a puzzle so strange and so clever that it is easy to forget the human cost. A real man died, and a real woman sat on a staircase all night, unable to let go of his hand. The police arrived and they began to work the impossible, and almost at once they ran into the first wall. Motive, because there did not seem to be one. There was no wealthy recluse here with grasping heirs. It was not a criminal with enemies. It was a beloved schoolmaster in a quiet town. They looked at the obvious possibilities, and one by one, the obvious possibilities collapsed in their hands. Every theory that would have made this simple turned out to be a dead end. Could it have been an expelled student, nursing a grudge? It did not hold. The boys he had disciplined were, if anything, loyal to him. The idea that one of them would return from the dark with a shotgun simply did not fit the man they described. Could it have been a jealous husband? The police did chase that thread, and it led somewhere interesting. Within 24 hours, they had identified a young woman who was one of Speer's closest friends. Lively, pretty, and remarkably well connected. She was said to be a descendant of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the favorite cousin of one of the richest men in America. She and her husband kept a summer home nearby. She used to tie a bandana around her head and go driving with Elliott in his convertible, the top down. She asked him for advice on her personal troubles. It was the kind of friendship that could, in the wrong light, look like something more. So the investigators looked hard at the possibility of a jealous husband. And that thread, too, came to nothing solid. So now the police had a beloved man, murdered with cold precision, and no motive that made any sense. Every ordinary door was closing, which meant the answer was not going to be ordinary at all. They combed the ground outside that window. They searched for the spot where the killer had stood, for a footprint, a shell, any trace of the patient figure who had waited in the dark. The killer had chosen their position carefully, with a clear line to the lit study, and enough cover to melt away afterward. And then the dogs told them something that changed the entire shape of the case. They brought in tracking dogs to follow whatever scent the killer had left in the darkness around that window. And the trail those dogs followed did not lead away into the woods, or off towards some passing stranger, or out to the road. The newspapers of the time summed up the result in a single chilling phrase. The dogs, they said, revealed the killer to be a household intimate. Read that again. Not a stranger, not an intruder from outside this little world. Someone who belonged to it. Someone whose scent was already all over that house and that campus, because they moved through it every single day. Someone Elliott Speer knew, and trusted, and very likely spoke to often. The killer was not an outsider who had come to Mount Hermon. The killer was already there. And think about what that meant for everyone left alive on that campus. In the days after the shooting, every person in that small community had to live with an unbearable thought. The man or woman who did this was very likely someone they knew, someone who sat with them at meals, someone who bowed their head beside them in chapel, someone who offered condolences to the grieving widow with the same hands that had held the shotgun. The murderer was not out there. The murderer was among them, wearing an ordinary, familiar face. And that transforms everything, because now the pool of suspects was not the whole world. It was the small, closed, respectable community of a single prep school, the faculty, the staff. The The people who ate at the same tables, worshipped in the same chapel, and passed Elliott Speer in the same corridors every day. One of those familiar, trusted faces had stood in the dark and killed him, so the search narrowed to a nightmare. The killer was a familiar face in a small, trusting community, but which one? Dozens of people fit that description, and every one of them was now, quietly, a suspect. And that is when the investigators found the two clues that lift this case out of an ordinary murder and into something that feels almost literary, almost authored. The first was a letter. Someone had produced a note written on the headmaster's own personal letterhead, in what looked like his own hand, but it was a forgery, a crafted, deliberate imitation of Elliott Speer's writing. Think about what that tells you. Whoever did this was not just violent, they were a forger, patient enough and skilled enough to study another man's handwriting and reproduce it. Someone who could counterfeit Elliott Speer's very identity on paper. That is not rage, that is craft. That is a person composing a story and signing another man's name to it. And the letters at the heart of this case cut deeper than a single forgery. There were notes tangled up in the investigation, letters that spoke to and about the people in Speer's world, including one addressed to a man called Tom. Correspondence became a thread investigators pulled at for a long time. Who wrote what? In whose hand? To whom? In a world of educated, literate men who lived by the written word itself became a weapon and a disguise. But it was the second clue that has haunted this case for 90 years. Because in Elliott Speer's own library, on his own shelves, among his own books, sat a mystery novel. And that novel described the murder of a headmaster, an English headmaster, shot dead almost exactly the way Elliott Speer had just been shot dead. Sit with that for a moment. A man is killed in a very specific, very unusual way. Ambushed through the window of his study by a patient killer in the dark. And a work of fiction describing that precise scenario was found sitting in the victim's own home. In that novel, an English schoolmaster is shot, killed by a hidden gunman, in a setting not so different from the leafy, orderly world of Mount Hermon itself. And now the headmaster who owned that very book lay dead, shot by a hidden gunman, in his own leafy, orderly school. Was it coincidence? Or had someone read that book, closed it, and decided to make it real? Had a murderer used a detective novel as a blueprint, staging a real man's death to follow the pages of a story? There is a particular horror in that idea. Most killers are driven by feeling, rage, fear, greed, panic. But a person who copies a novel is doing something colder. They are treating a human life as raw material for a plot. They are not just ending a man, they are telling a story, and casting him as the corpse. Either the most unsettling coincidence imaginable, or the coldest thing in the entire case. A killer who did not just want Elliott Speer dead, but wanted him dead like a character in a book. And once you see the crime that way, as something composed rather than committed, a suspect begins to come into focus. A suspect the investigators circled for years and never dared to name out loud. To understand him, you have to go back to the reforms. Remember, Elliott Speer had come to that old, rigid, deeply traditional school and begun to change it, to modernize it, to pull it into a new century, and most people welcomed that. But not everyone welcomes change. In an old institution, there is almost always someone who preferred the old ways, someone whose status, whose authority, whose whole sense of importance was tied to the traditions this newcomer was quietly dismantling. And at Mount Hermon, there was a man in exactly that position. He was the school's dean, a senior figure, and by the accounts that have come down to us, he was a man with two very good reasons to resent Elliott Speer. The first was the reforms themselves. He was, by nature and belief, aligned with the strict old ways that Speer was softening. Every change the headmaster made was, in a sense, a rebuke to the world the dean had built his life around. And the second reason was more personal, and more bitter. The dean, it is said, had been passed over. He had wanted the top job. He had reason to feel the headmaster's chair should have been his, and instead it had gone to this younger, popular, reforming outsider. Resentment over ideas, resentment over a promotion denied. A man who moved through that campus every single day as a trusted, familiar figure, exactly the kind of household intimate those tracking dogs had pointed to. The investigation circled him, quietly and for a long time. There was even, at one stage, a secret inquest. A formal examination of the case held behind closed doors, away from the public and the press. Its transcript was thought to be lost for decades, until it resurfaced generations later and let people finally see what had been discussed in that room. Behind those closed doors, the hard questions were asked. Who had the motive? Who had the skill? Who moved through that household like a shadow? And still, at the end of it all, the machinery of justice simply stopped. And yet nothing happened. No arrest, no public accusation, no trial. The man was watched, suspected, circled, and never once formally charged with anything. And that watching was not a matter of days. It went on for years. Investigators kept their eyes on their suspect long after the headlines had died, long after the country had moved on. The case was never truly closed. It was simply left open and quiet, with a suspect walking free under a shadow that never lifted and never turned into a charge. Imagine living inside that, being watched for years, suspected of the worst thing a person can do, and never given the chance to be cleared in a courtroom or condemned in one. And imagine, if you were innocent, what that suspicion would do to a life. Or, if you were guilty, what it would mean to have quite literally gotten away with it, in plain sight, for the rest of your days. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question in this entire case. If suspicion pointed so strongly at one familiar figure, why did the law never act? And here you have to think about what Mount Hermon was. A prestigious, deeply religious institution, with a proud name and powerful trustees. The kind of place that lives and dies by its reputation. Now imagine the scandal. Imagine putting a senior member of that school on trial for ambushing and murdering its own beloved headmaster. Imagine the newspapers, already running the story for days, feasting on a courtroom drama. A trial that would drag the entire institution's name through the mud for months. A powerful institution, faced with a choice between a painful truth and a protected reputation, does not always choose the truth. And this was an institution with every reason, and every resource, to protect itself. There has always been a suspicion, never proven, that some people preferred the quiet of an unsolved mystery to the roar of a solved one. That a blank final page was, to certain powerful people, more comfortable than a page with a name on it. That it was better for the school to have a ghost than a defendant. If that is true, then Elliott Speer was killed twice. Once by the person outside his window, and once by the silence that followed. The silence that decided his murder was less important than a school's good name. I want to be fair here, because these are real people, and nothing was ever proven against anyone. The dean was never charged, and being suspected is not the same as being guilty. The case is unsolved precisely because no one could, or would, prove it. That cuts both ways. Maybe the evidence truly was not there, or maybe no one with the power to act was willing to pay the price of acting. But step back and look at the whole shape of it, and you can see why this case has never let go of the people who study it. A beloved headmaster is murdered with cold, patient precision. The killer forges his very handwriting. The killing mirrors a novel sitting on his own shelf. Tracking dogs point not outward at a stranger, but inward, at someone who belonged to the household. Suspicion settles on a resentful, passed-over dean. And then the whole thing simply stops, unsolved, as if a decision had been made somewhere that the truth was more dangerous than the mystery. Step into the mind of whoever did this, just for a moment. They did not act in a burst of fury. They studied. They chose a novel's plot, or something close to it. They learned to copy a dead man's handwriting well enough to fool the people who knew it. They picked a spot, a night, an angle. They waited for their victim to stand. And afterward, they walked back into their own life and wore an innocent face for the rest of it. That is not a murderer in the ordinary sense. That is an author. Someone who treated a real death as a plot to be constructed, clue by clue. Someone who kept enough control of the story to make sure it never got a final chapter. It is, in the end, a murder that reads like one of the very detective novels it seems to have been copied from. A closed circle of suspects, a country setting, a clever, cold killer who staged the scene and forged the clues, and a final chapter that was, deliberately or not, left unwritten. Elliott Speer was 35 years old. He was, by nearly every account, a genuinely good man, trying to do a genuinely good thing, dragging a strict old school gently into a kinder century. And for that, someone he trusted stood in the dark outside his window and ended his life. Then they vanished into a silence that has lasted more than 90 years. There is a bitter irony in how the world forgot him. The Speer case was pushed aside by another crime against another innocent, the Lindbergh child. one unsolved horror buried beneath a bigger one. The public has only so much attention for grief, and Elliott Speer's share of it ran out fast. His wife sat on a staircase and held his hand and could not let go, and the country turned the page to the next sensation. The truth of what happened at Mount Hermon settled quietly into the New England hills, where it remains. For years afterward, the school went on. Boys arrived and graduated. New headmasters came. Chapel bells rang across the same lawns. And somewhere in that continuing ordinary life, if the theory is right, the person responsible went on living an ordinary life too, teaching, aging, dying eventually of natural causes, having never spent a single night in a cell for the patient, clever, cold-blooded thing they did outside that window. So the verdict, in the end, is left to you, the same way it was left to history. The resentful dean who was watched but never charged. A stranger the dog somehow missed, or a killer this story has not even named. After more than 90 years, an honest guess is all any of us can offer. The trail is cold, the witnesses are gone, and the one person who knew for certain took the answer to the grave. So tell me down in the comments, who do you think stood outside Elliott Speer's window that night? And do you believe the people who knew simply could not prove it, or that they chose, for the good of a proud old school, to let the last page stay blank? I will be reading them, and I want to know where your instinct lands. I read every single one.